Hi, and welcome to RachAquarelle, and welcome to my holiday art series where I am doing a Christmas or winter themed project in watercolor each day between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And today I'm going to show you how to make a very simple greeting card. This is going to be very easy and quick. And my card is 6 inches tall and 4 inches wide. And what I do is I actually buy large pads of watercolor paper and I just cut them down to the sizes that I want. It makes it really easy to be able to have a variety of sizes for any kind of project and to not feel like I'm ever wasting paper. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is use some masking fluid with this toothbrush, and I'm just going to spritz the masking fluid all over the card. Don't need to get it anywhere in particular. And let that dry completely. And now we're going to do a lot of wet into wet. And this is going to be a very simple card, as I said, and it's going to depict kind of a skyscape. So I was looking at photo references of just like the Milky Way at night, trying to get inspired because sometimes just a dark blue sky is a little bit uninteresting. And while I do want to keep this card very simple, I still want it to have a little bit of visual interest. So I'm going to go in first at the top with a lot of blue. I'm using a mix of cobalt blue and ultramarine. And I'm just trying to apply as much pigment up here as I possibly can. And you can see that I got that entire top, probably 2/3 of the card wet. And now I'm going to start adding in some permanent rose. And this is just a nice kind of magenta red. And I'm tilting up the card just to let it start coming down. And you can see that because I only wetted the card down to a certain point, that even if I tilt the card, the colors are not going to go past that point where I stopped applying water. And I didn't really sketch a line in where I was going to stop applying the water, but you certainly can if you want to. It won't be noticeable if you do. All right, so now I'm gonna go in even more up at the top with more pigment. I want it to be really dark up there. And you can see that the masking fluid that I spritzed onto the card is giving the impression of some stars in the sky. And I'm going to leave the bottom 1/3 of this card completely white. So it's going to be a little snowy, and that is where I'm going to write a little greeting. And the cool thing about making your own cards in watercolor is that even though it might seem daunting to create a handmade card and then to think about sending that out to a bunch of people, one thing that you can do is actually just scan your card and then upload it to one of the websites that will actually print cards for you and just make those ahead of time. And then you kind of have a handmade card that you can send to everyone, but you didn't have to go and make each one individually. So now I've waited and I've allowed all of that to dry completely, and I'm using my fingers just to brush away the masking fluid. And you just want to make sure, first of all, that your paint is 100% dry, that it's not even slightly damp or soft. And then you want to use very gentle motions so that you don't end up tearing into the paper. All right, so the next part of this card is going to be really fun. So I made this little template and it is free for you to download. The link is in the description. And I basically just tried to think of lots of different Christmas or holiday sayings that you might want to put on a card. And then I created those in different fonts. And you can see that it's going to be really easy just to be able to transfer these onto any card or design that you want. And you can kind of just pick whichever one fits the occasion, and you can just save the piece of paper that you print out and use it over and over and over again. So I was kind of getting frustrated trying to, every single time I wanted to do a project, I had to go onto my computer and try to figure out exactly what I wanted to say and exactly what I wanted it to look like. So I decided just to make it a little easier on myself. And I just transferred that to my card with some carbon paper. And now we are going to go in with some ink. Now I'm going to be using India ink for this, but you actually can use any ink that you want, and you don't have to use a dip pen, you don't have to use a brush, you can just use any pen that you feel like using. As long as your watercolor is dry, it doesn't matter what kind of ink you put on top of it. I just really like to do it this way. But you could certainly just use a pen or whatever you feel most comfortable with, or whatever you happen to have handy. And what I'm going to do here is just dip my brush into a little bit of the ink. And then I'm going to add some water just to kind of dilute it a little bit so it's not so black, especially at first, while I'm just trying to figure out placement. And I'm going to start drawing in some trees. And now I'm not looking at any pictures of trees to do this. The best tip that I have for doing trees, especially when they are bare trees, they don't have any leaves on them, so you're going to see every branch and twig, use straight lines. Well, that's my advice, but of course you don't have to do that. I see a lot of people making stylized trees with lots of curvy lines. Personally, I like the more natural look. And so I like to use a lot of straight lines, and I basically am just going to place those lines at different angles. And I'm going to start out each tree by just doing the trunk of the tree and then some of the main branches. And then once I get those all in place, I will then go in and add a few twigs, but I'm not going to go overboard with that. I'm going to keep this relatively simple. Basically, I just wanted this card to depict a very earthy scene, but also kind of, a majestic or surreal or heavenly scene. And so I think that makes sense with the saying, which is joy to the world. And another tip that I have for trees is don't try to be too precise. So let your brush or your pen skip around. Don't worry about everything connecting perfectly. Don't worry about things going exactly where you initially planned for them to go. Just kind of go for it, because trees, they kind of do their own thing. And as long as you're using relatively straight lines and varying your angles, you're going to get a really convincing tree. And I would also recommend not going too overboard with the number of trees in this scene, because it's really going to be easy just to kind of clutter this up, and the idea is for it to be relatively simple. So, and that's as much of a reminder to myself as to anyone else who, like me, tends to just kind of go overboard with things, because sometimes it's just really fun making lines, and yeah, before you know it, you've got kind of a mess. So I always have to kind of hold myself back. So now I've got a much smaller brush, and I dipped that back into the India ink, but this time I didn't really dilute it with any water. And now I'm starting to go over the lettering, trying to be very careful, of course, because the lettering is still pretty small, and I'm not really used to doing any kind of lettering with a brush. So I'm just trying to be a little, maybe extra careful, but I think it's a balance. You want to be somewhat careful, but you also don't want to trip yourself up trying to be too careful. That's kind of what always happens to me. It's like I start concentrating a little bit too much, and then something happens that I didn't intend. So, and it's a handmade card, so it's totally fine for it to look handmade. And now I'm going to use this smaller brush to start adding some twigs and to start darkening up the trees where they are. They do look pretty dark from the view of the camera, but when I was looking up close, I could tell they were a little bit translucent because I did dilute that ink with water. just so that they wouldn't be so dark right at first. So now I'm going in and just kind of reinforcing those lines with just pure ink. And I'm using watercolor brushes. These are just like really cheap craft watercolor brushes that I had lying around. I'm not going to use my regular watercolor brushes to do ink because even after you wash a brush really, really well, there might still be some pigment left in there. So I definitely don't want to use a brush that has ink pigments with my watercolor. So I just kind of keep those separate. And I'm a little bit pickier about the brushes I use for watercolor than I am about brushes I use for any kind of inking. So these are just cheapos that I can easily replace. And another advice that I have for doing trees, especially when you're doing the smaller twigs, is to kind of use a bit of a flicking motion. So start out pressing your brush to the paper pretty firmly, but then as you move toward the edge of the twig, you just want to give it a little bit of a flick, and you'll get some really nice tapered ends right there. And again, just, don't go overboard. Keep it relatively simple. You don't have to, go in and paint every single twig that is on a tree, just like millions and millions of twigs. So keep it relatively simple. Just give yourself enough so that there's a good variety in there. And I think that you'll be very happy with the outcome of that project. And that is going to be it for this little project. I'm just going to clean up all of my supplies as always. So these are my cheapo little ink brushes I like to use. And you can see I didn't even really have to clean up my palette this time because I just was able to directly apply pigments onto the card, and that made it really simple. Oh, and I used a little piece of tape on the inside of the card so it wouldn't pop up as I was painting. And there's the result. Very simple, but I think really, really elegant and fun.